Good evening and welcome to Between the Lines. I'm John Matisonn. My guest tonight is Andrew Harding, the BBC's correspondent based in Johannesburg, but his book is about Somalia, the Mayor of Mogadishu. Welcome, Andrew.
Thank you very much, John.
Andrew, you've made Somalia accessible with this book, and you've obviously used the device of a single character, the mayor. Did you intend to use it to explain Somalia?
Yes, I mean, it's a book that I hope will appeal to not just Somali nerds or Horn of Africa obsessives or people who want to know the detailed history. I wanted to tell a personal story, a story of this man whose life seemed to follow the contours of Somalia's dramas over the last half century. From, he was born as a nomad, became an orphan in Mogadishu when the city was really on the up, and I wanted to kind of give a sense to people of quite how promising Mogadishu, like Kabul and Baghdad, these places that are synonymous to the modern era with destruction, you know, how great things were. And then to follow the exile, the diaspora. He spent 20 years in London. That's been such an experience, as people in South Africa know. So many Somalis ended up here too. And then the return, and this extraordinary moment now where, of course, in South Africa in '94, everyone said, okay, we can come home now. We've had an election, we've had a constitution, and so on. But this awful, long, drawn-out agony for Somalis who fled abroad of not knowing quite when the point comes to go back. And that point has been spread over the last decade, and people have taken huge risks, like my character, Tarzan, who went back to become mayor in 2010 when the city was still a war zone. And today, you know, we've just seen recently a presidential election, a very successful election, relatively speaking, in Somalia, and progress. But clearly also some huge problems still there.
We're going to go back to the bigger picture issues, but first tell us a little bit more about the mayor. His name was Tarzan. His nickname was Tarzan. Why is he called that?
He was found swinging from a tree before dawn in a dormitory in Mogadishu in the 1960s. This skinny little boy in shorts trying to avoid the morning queue for breakfast. And the teacher said, "Oi, Tarzan, come down from there." And that stuck. And I like that anecdote because it says a lot about Somalia. It says, first of all, they knew Tarzan. They knew that because the city was full of open-air cinemas in those days. And they got the latest westerns, the latest Fellini films from Rome, the old Italian colonial influence there. And, of course, as well added to that, this culture of incredible interest in poetry, in name-calling, in nicknames. And so Tarzan, it stuck for this little urchin boy, and he essentially reinvented himself as this tough little kid and fought anybody who dared to try and call him something else. And he, in a sense, that's the secret to his political career now, this very tough, brave politician.
Now, he grew up in an orphanage, as you say, was a fighter, defended himself, didn't expect anyone else to defend him. But he, as you say, he reinvents himself, and he does seem to have a very principled opposition to what we would call tribalism, what there would be called clan connections. And so eventually he lands up as mayor of Mogadishu and makes quite a difference.
He does. I mean, he was lucky in the timing. He came back at a time when this transitional government had been inserted like a heart transplant operation into the middle of this mess of a city with Al-Shabaab, the Islamist militants, controlling most of it. They had this little government that was stuck in the middle, protected by thousands of African Union peacekeepers. And slowly, with the help of these peacekeepers, Al-Shabaab was pushed out. And so Tarzan was there at a time of hope. And he became this catalytic figure, this representation of determination, of the diaspora, come back, risk your life, now's the time, now is your 1994 moment, if you like. And for a while, he was hugely popular and hugely influential in making people understand what it might be like to have a government again. You know, 20 years of anarchy, no government, clan law, warlord rule. And so he capitalized on that, and he had this energy and this ability to make decisions and frankly, bravery to make decisions in a city where every square inch is contested ground and, you know, multiple families claiming each city block. And he would go in and I watched him going around, deciding. And of course, that made him a huge number of enemies.
Now, what did he achieve? What could he change?
it's tricky because there's always the possibility of things sliding back in Mogadishu, and we mentioned the elections earlier, and that's another clear positive step. But is Somalia beyond the point of no return now? Hard to say. I hope so. During his time, and he had nearly 4 years in office, he can't take credit for the security. That was the army, that was the government, that was the African Union. But within the city, he played this catalytic role, getting streetlights put up, for instance. And it wasn't that he put them up himself, but he became this figure, this facilitator, that people who were fed up, governments who were fed up with the UN, who sat in Nairobi trying to administer and control from overseas, and fed up with corruption in the Somali transitional government, they turned to the mayor as somebody who could get things done.
When he took over as mayor, he got a message from the last mayor saying you're $400,000 in debt, which he soon wrote off. But that meant he started with nothing. So what else was he able to do? Streetlights?
Streetlights, business taxes for local businesses, clearing away the rubbish. I mean, we're talking about a city that did not function in any way that we would recognize in terms of local government. So simply clearing away decades of rubbish, of trying to organize generators so that they could power some of the streetlights that weren't solar powered, trying to organize cleanup groups who could go around, and above all, yes, trying to settle the conflicts over ownership, over business, and to make decisions.
I'm not going to give away the story by saying what happens to him and how his political role progresses. But when we come back, I'm going to ask you more about what are the forces, Al-Shabaab, Somalia is a place with pirates, with Al-Shabaab, with failed state period, Soviet history, but we'll be back in a moment. And we're back with Andrew Harding, the author of The Mayor of Mogadishu, a story of chaos and redemption in the ruins of Somalia. Andrew, the history of Somalia in many ways parallels places like Ethiopia, some other countries that had Soviet influence for a time, Afghanistan, where I've spent time. Perhaps we can just start off by going through some of these periods. The Soviet era, I know in Afghanistan, and you seem to say the same in your book, in Somalia, the Soviet era had some positive elements. They were opposed to gender discrimination. They wanted women to have equal rights and jobs and so on. Some things went well, and then it went bad.
There was a coup in '69, and Siad Barre, this military leader, took power with certainly Soviet encouragement.
Right.
And for a time, as you say, made really big strides. He was virulently against clanism,
yes,
and tried to stamp that out. He was a big proponent of literacy, and Tarzan's future wife and friends described to me going out on these massive convoys out into the nomad interior of Somalia, this huge campaign in '74 to spread this new alphabet that they decided on, the Roman alphabet in fact, but they'd transliterated Somali, which had been only an oral language until then. And almost overnight, Somalia became this very literate society, and the rest of Africa, newly independent countries, looked to Siad Barre as a man who got things done in a way that many other countries could only dream of.
Until that time, the tradition of poetry was that purely oral.
Exactly, yes.
Wow.
I mean, they would write in in Arabic, perhaps, or Italian, or a language imported, but they didn't have their own, and that was a source of great debate and, at some point, humiliation.
So why did it go wrong?
Well, the Soviet influence was the original sin, if you like. What happened was that Somalia and Ethiopia, which had big territorial disputes stretching way back, went to war over the Ogaden. And for a time, the Somalis thought, well, with Soviet backing, we can do this. But the trouble was that the Ethiopians had had their own coup. Mengistu had taken power there. And they were even more a Soviet client state and a bigger, more radical client state. And so in the middle of the early days of this war, the Soviet Union went, we're backing both sides. This isn't going to work. We'll side with the Ethiopians, at which point the Americans quickly stepped in, and suddenly they were backing the Somalis, which meant that very quickly there was a huge amount of weaponry in the region. We know that almost inevitably drives conflict.
And then, another classic Cold War.
And then you have a situation of a dictator, and I think this is a similar situation we've seen recurring all over Africa. A strong man, a man with good intentions, loses his nerve and struggles to keep the economy growing and falls back when he's being criticized by the opposition on a clan mentality. He blames or he uses the clans as a way of dividing his opposition.
Having done the opposite for a time.
Exactly. Yeah. He plays back. Suddenly Siad Barre is being guarded only by his own clansmen. And the opposition, when there are coup attempts, he says, well, it was that clan. And he chooses a half dozen soldiers to execute from the same clan to suggest the coup wasn't a general oppositional thing. It was
and also becomes corrupt.
Exactly. And brutal crackdown on opposition throughout Somalia. And at some point it gets to the point where he's sending jet planes in to bomb Hargeisa, northern city, pushing tens of thousands of refugees out of the country across the border into Ethiopia, and a point basically beyond which there was no return for the opposition. It became clan warfare.
I want to move on to Al-Shabaab, because now it's known as an Al-Qaeda connected terrorist organization. But you had some sense of Al-Shabaab in its early days. How did that evolve?
Well, Al-Shabaab is many different things. It is a terrorist group linked to Al-Qaeda with a very internationalist Islamist agenda, but it is also, has been, a place for proud, conservative, young nationalist Somalis who wanted to defend their country from an Ethiopian invasion, which came in the mid-2000s when Al-Shabaab and the Islamic courts, which emerged from the local court system, took power and suddenly ended the warlordism, ended the anarchy. And people like Tarzan, the mayor at that time, came rushing back from London going, at last, the Islamists, a bit like the Taliban, are doing what no one else could do. They're ending the war. But the Ethiopians convinced the Americans, with partial justification, that there were bad Al-Qaeda elements in the Islamic courts and that there was no possibility ever of doing a deal with these people. So
do you think there was no possibility of doing a deal?
I think those within the Somali community in Mogadishu who thought there were probably being naive. I think the people, the hardliners, were taking power, and that's so often the case. I've seen it in Chechnya, I've seen it elsewhere, that the hardliners, the loudest voices take control.
But you're very critical of America and of the CIA's role there. Or does that suggest they could have done things differently?
For sure. I mean, they could at least have given some time to see if the Islamic courts could gain in strength, push back against the hardliners from their own ranks, and perhaps from the ground up, if you like, create some sort of representative government, even just at a local level. Because the tragedy now is that there are big parts of Somalia, this vast country, that have been left alone, have been free from foreign meddling, and have developed, for instance, up in the north, in Somaliland, their own grassroots, credible democracy from the grassroots up, and that's been key. Where the international community has tried to come in and impose, it's all been bad.
Well, that seems to be common because the way the international community comes in into countries generally seems to be so short-term.
It does, and I think the problem is that the international community wants to create institutions that it recognizes, that it can shake hands with. So it needs a central government. It needs an army. And when a country's been left to fall apart for 20 years, that process of building those institutions is A, incredibly expensive, B, is going to take decades, and C, lacks fundamentally any legitimacy from the get-go. Because, for instance, even today, if the African Union forces from Uganda, Burundi and elsewhere were to leave, an hour later the city would be overrun. The whole country would be overrun by al-Shabaab. The government and its military don't yet have the credibility and the motive, if you like, to fight for their own security because they've been reliant on outside forces.
And we'll be right back. And we're back talking to Andrew Harding, author of The Mayor of Mogadishu. Andrew, I want to just touch on the pirates. People around the world know of Somalia probably as much about the pirates, of course, helped by Hollywood and Tom Hanks as well. What caused that, and where is it now?
It was caused by joblessness and...
as the country unraveled.
Exactly, and these fishing communities, which were looking for a source of income, saw these foreign trawlers going up and essentially robbing their maritime areas. Somalia's rich sea was being robbed by trawlers from all over the world. And so you have a combination, a potent combination of nationalism, we're protecting our waters, and criminality, or at least job seeking by young Somalis who would go out and got lured into more and more sort of brave, bold, outrageous, criminal, crazy behavior as they realized that it was possible that a group of people in a skiff with a couple of guns could take over a supertanker because of the rules at sea about how you're not allowed guns on board ships and so on. So it was one of these things. They opened a door, they opened it a bit further, and they found that it was a very lucrative, for a time, source of income. And because of the lack of any authority on this longest coastline in Africa, it was very difficult to stop.
And so the international community then spent billions of dollars to try and address this, it bringing in American naval vessels and all sorts of things. And they have more or less brought it under control? They
have. It's a combination, I think, of the armada, of probably a lot of pirates shot out at sea, perhaps away from the cameras, and also the sea itself, which gets very rough and has no doubt killed a lot of these pirates, and the fact that in some areas, and I wouldn't perhaps overstress this, but in some areas there has been a concerted attempt on land to tackle piracy and to lock up pirates. And
looking at the international intervention, which seems to be really in crisis in many countries, is it time for a new model? Is there a new model possible?
Somalia is a good example of what not to do. It has been. Is it a good example of what to do? I doubt it. I think it's been a very long, very flawed process. I mean, I think the ultimate, the original sin was for the outside world to abandon Somalia completely in the early 90s when there was a famine, Black Hawk Down, as we all know from the film, and the Americans, dead bodies, Marines being dragged through the streets. The UN pulled out, the Americans pulled out, and once you do that, it's very difficult to
That's exactly what happened in Afghanistan. After the Mujahideen were defeated and America felt it had won the war, from the movie Charlie Wilson's War, people just said, we were willing to spend billions to fight. Now that the fight's over, they wouldn't spend tiny fractions of that for the peace.
Yes, I mean, the international community spent a lot of time trying to foster negotiations amongst the different Somali clans, endless peace conferences, and those conferences often never got anywhere, but at least they were talking. And it was, I think, an important part of the process. The trouble was that it wasn't the right groups who were talking. It was people who were going to Nairobi, staying in expensive hotels, representing narrow clan interests. It wasn't the al-Shabaab leaders who were causing problems and who needed to be brought in as well.
So is there an answer for next time, for the next country where this happens?
It's so easy to be glib. One looks at Somaliland in the north, successful, and you go, well, of course you need to do it from the ground up. But it's never there's never a point where it's easy to say, well, of course, we just have to do it that way. By that time, you have troops committed, you have programs, you have a situation with Al-Shabaab linked to Al-Qaeda now that you can't just sit down and quickly make peace.
But to some extent, isn't it part of the hubris of the international community, especially perhaps the West, that they think they can control all these countries? There is this ambition to make sure that so many countries go your way. When it was the Cold War, now in the era of terrorism, that they overreach.
They overreached, but again, in Somalia, you've had this humanitarian crisis rolling over with successive famines, and when there aren't famines, there's real humanitarian need. And so when you don't have a government able to deliver that aid, it's almost inevitable that there's going to be mission creep, if you
right.
like, purely on a humanitarian front. And then that gets wrapped in with the politics.
Yeah. But the problems, as you say, there's an original sin much earlier. Before we run out of time, I wanted to ask you, because you know South Africa so well, and you also know Mogadishu, Somalia, and many other parts of Africa. What reason would you give why South Africans should read this book?
Well, I would give the same reason I give to people in London, in a way. You know, we see so many Somalis here in Cape Town, on the streets in Johannesburg, in townships with spaza shops, making business, often misunderstood, often heavily criticised. And I think it's important, if we're going to push back against xenophobia, and also if we're going to understand the motives and the clan connections, for instance, of Somalis, the reason they're so sophisticated, they're so well connected, such good businessmen. I think it's useful to understand where they've come from, what they've lost, why they are here, how long they're going to stay, what's motivating them, and what country is back home. So I think in that sense it's a window into that world.
Is there another relevance that has to do with the way South Africa goes? There's such a big difference between South Africa and Somalia on so many levels, but we also see leadership come in, presidents come in with good intentions apparently, and yet then things fall apart. Is there a way of understanding how that happens from looking at Somalia or other countries that's relevant to us?
Well, I hope one can't make too many comparisons between South
not.
Africa and Somalia, and I don't think it would be fair. But I think the fundamental message, and one that is slowly being understood by Somali politicians, is that it does boil down fundamentally to institutions and to strong leadership. But the institutions are fundamental. And once you start to erode them and to erode their credibility, and I mean, we don't need to be talking about South Africa, we could be talking about the United States. Once you start undermining people's trust, confidence in judiciary, in prosecution, in rule of law, then it's very hard to rebuild that.
You're talking about President Trump's calling judges so-called judges and that kind of undermining of the judiciary. Yes, it is very interesting because the US looks less like a model than ever, and South Africa's institutions are starting to fight back now in a way that's robust and very healthy and encouraging.
Well, that's the beauty of this country. You can wake up every day and have a completely different view on where it's going. Incredible cause for optimism here, and perfectly good reasons to be rather gloomy.
To be irritated, yes. Well, thanks. That was Andrew Harding. His book is The Mayor of Mogadishu, a story of chaos and redemption in the ruins of Somalia. That's our show. Thanks for watching, and happy reading. Good night.